Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today I wanted to share with you the Scorpio Sea Tarot by Maggie Stiefvater with text by Melissa Sinova. So this is a relatively new deck from Llewellyn that just came out in 2020. It comes in their standard big box. We have a beautiful full color guidebook, which I'll talk about here in a moment, and of course the cards that sit inside. So I had initially intended to do this video as a sort of walkthrough, and then I realized as I was kind of working my way through the cards, kind of getting to know them, reading the full guidebook, that I did really need to spend some time getting to know this deck before I could really kind of articulate what my feelings were about it and how I found working with it. So before we begin, I kind of want to read a few portions from the guidebook just so that you can kind of get an understanding of where this deck is coming from. Now, this deck is based on a book called The Scorpio Races by Maggie Stiefvater. I have not read the book or any of her books, to be perfectly honest, and I was a little bit worried when I first started working with this deck, first started diving into it, that I was going to be limited by the fact that I hadn't read the book. Now, perhaps there are some things that do correlate to the book and the story. However, I didn't find that there was really any reference to specific events or characters or anything in the guidebook, so I didn't feel like not having a knowledge of the book was a hindrance in any way, shape, or form. If you know tarot, you can work with this deck. It's very much based on the Rider-Waite-Smith system. However, it does kind of do its own thing a little bit here and there, as Llewellyn decks tend to do. So let me just read a little bit from the guidebook because I think that's kind of important in creating some context of where this deck is coming from. So it says, the Scorpio Sea Tarot is not a warm and fuzzy deck. This deck asks you to go beyond the surface. It asks you to peel back the skin of your reality and look deep, deep inside, past the story of yourself that you carry in your head, past the explanations that your world or the people in it have handed to you, past the knowledge that you have, and back to the knowledge of your ancestors. These cards tap into the ocean and the untamable spirit of nature. So I really was quite drawn to that in terms of an introduction. So I was thinking maybe this might be a deck that even if you're not familiar with the storylines or the fiction books that this deck relates to, that it might still be a deck that we could work with. So I do want to also just read a little bit about that, which we have here. It says, the Scorpio Sea Tarot deck covers the tarot's bones by reaching back into Celtic mythology and the cold northern waters of the sea around Ireland, England, and Scotland. This deck, this watery, elemental, mythology-driven beauty, is a marriage of deep, old, grandmother knowledge and the wisdom of the magic, both big and small, that creates the tarot. These cards are influenced by the book, The Scorpio Races by Maggie Stiefvater, the deck's artist, and the legends, Celtic mythology, horses, and astrological sign of Scorpio. And then it talks about how this deck really relates to the energy of Scorpio. Now, if you are a Scorpio, that might really be a draw for you for this deck. I have very little Scorpio in my astrology chart, and so I'm a little bit unsure about how that energy is going to reflect for me. But I do like that they at least acknowledge that this is where the deck kind of comes from. Now I just kind of want to jump to the back because we have in the conclusion here another little snippet that I thought might be really interesting. Scorpio Sea Tarot comes from waves crashing on the beach. It was born of fantastical creatures living alongside your butcher or baker. This is a marriage of all that can be and all that might be, the highs and the lows, the passion and heartbreak. This is tarot at its core, the whole of human experience summarized into 78 cards. I am on board with this being a deck of connecting to the human experience, which I also feel like is the core of tarot as well. So I've divided my deck back up into its 4 suits and its major arcana so that we could talk a little bit about how I've found the structure with this deck in kind of my first little getting to know it over the last couple of weeks as I have worked my way through each of the cards individually. I've read the guidebook from cover to cover, and then I started working through some readings with this deck. Now, one of the things that I always do when I get a deck, whether it happens on camera or off, is that I always do my own kind of walkthrough in where I take the deck and I set it down just like I do on camera when I share it with you, and I go through the deck card by card and and I read the entry from the guidebook, look at the card, and look at the artwork. I'm also at that time looking at things like the overall structure of the deck, how the major arcana is brought together, how each of the suits are represented in the deck, and those are all kind of things that I'm looking at whenever I'm personally getting to know a deck. So I want to start with the major arcana with this deck because I do think that it's quite a strong major arcana in terms of what it's trying to do. I have pulled a couple cards out of order so that we could talk about them, because one of the things that I do quite like about this deck, even though I'm not a huge cat person, is we have the Fool as kind of like this young kitten who's easily distracted by all these butterflies, and in the World card, we have the mature cat who's now no longer distracted by the butterflies and kind of knows what they're about and what they're here to do. Here we have the Magician, and in this card, I always see, every time it comes up for me, Dick Van Dyke from Mary Poppins. Now, that's not a bad association to have with the Magician. And when you read the guidebook and she talks about kind of finding your soul purpose and following that, be it in work or in a hobby, I think that does work for this. It's definitely a different interpretation of the Magician than I have seen previously, or that I really work with personally. But it's interesting and I do like it. The High Priestess here is the Morgane and, the Triple Goddess, which I think actually works really well for the High Priestess. She'll kind of make you face your truth, be it the good or the bad sides of yourself. And I think that's really wonderful for the High Priestess. The Empress is the baker, basically, and the Emperor is the butcher. Now, I do like for these cards to be kind of like a pair, and I do feel that these do work well as a pair. We have the butcher, the baker. I'm kind of been looking for the candlestick maker, right? That old nursery rhyme, I think it is. I do really like, on the one hand, the humanized version of these. However, that's not really how I see the major arcana. I would see these energies as being more in the kings and queens because they're more in the mundane realm, whereas I see the archetypal energy of the major arcana being a little bit more larger than life, sort of mystical, magical, spiritual than in the everyday mundane. And I feel like these two characters, these two cards really bring that energy down into the human realm, in the human world. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, just a different way for me to look at these two cards because I don't tend to see these energies as being in the mundane world. Kind of the same with the Hierophant. It's a very traditional card. Again, when you read the guidebook, there's a bit more context that we come into understanding with this card. Otherwise, it just looks like your really typical Popey figure just kind of plunked down on the card. The Lovers card, again, it works. There's a lot of talk in the book about the sun and the moon coming together. I don't see that reflected in this artwork, which is fine, except for to me, this speaks again more in the mundane realm, same as we've seen with the last few cards that we've looked at. Little less kind of in the spiritual realm of things, more in the everyday human realm. To me, this looks more like a Two of Cups. I love this Chariot card. We have the two horses. They are pulling from, opposite directions, but they're still the same kind of being. We have kind of like two sides of the same coin, right? We have this kind of unbridled wild horse, and then we have the all buttoned up horse in the bridle. And it really speaks to the idea of kind of not pulling in two different directions, kind of getting everything into alignment, which I think is wonderful. I really do like the Strength card as well. In the guidebook, she definitely talks about focusing in on the character who's being very calm and serene. As somebody who grew up riding horses like my entire childhood, this Strength card to me makes sense because when you're dealing with an upset or out of control horse, the one thing you have to do is remain calm. Otherwise, they feed off your energy and it just makes the situation worse. So this is really, to me, about tapping into that internal strength and really about remaining calm amidst the chaos. I think that works really well for a Strength card. This Hermit card, I think not only is absolutely beautiful in its depiction, but the write-up in the guidebook is amazing. It talks about quieting everybody else's voice and following your own, because if you're listening to everybody else, you can't be listening to yourself. And I think that's wonderful for the Hermit. So here we have the Wheel of Fortune and we have the Man in the Boat. This card, having read the guidebook, makes much more sense to me than it did in just my first initial flip through when I was just looking through the cards. I really kind of had to read the story, get to understand where the intention is in this card. But the basic idea is, you know, there's a fisherman, he's standing in the boat. Sometimes he catches the fish, sometimes he doesn't. Such is the wheel, right? That's the way things go. And when we look here at Temperance, we see that it's the same image, the same man, and he's holding steady in the center. So the only thing that's different is we no longer have the fish, because whereas the Wheel of Fortune is about holding your ground and taking the fish when they come and being okay when they don't, the Temperance card is more about maintaining that inner balance regardless of the fish. And so I do quite like that. I don't think I would have gotten that had I not read the guidebook. If I had just taken these two cards at face value, I don't think I would have made that association, and I don't think they would have made as much sense to me. This is definitely a case where I think the guidebook is kind of imperative to understanding the nuances of this deck. Here we have the Justice card, and it talks about this little girl. Basically, she doesn't care how you feel about things. She just wants things to be right. I get that energy. We have the scales. It's fine. It doesn't really do anything wonderful for me. Again, without having that background information from reading the guidebook, I don't think I would really make that connection with this card, other than it's just a girl holding a scale, right? Here we have the Hanged Man. The write-up in the guidebook really didn't make a whole lot of sense to me in relation to the artwork on this card. Again, it's fine, it works. I can totally read it as a hangman, but some of the key points that were made in the guidebook aren't visually represented on the card. Here we have the Death card. This card I think is quite awesome. However, I would not have understood it at all had I not read the story in the guidebook. There's a skeleton horse and he comes to your door and you have to kind of pass his test. I would not have made that connection at all. So again, same deal over and over again. Here we have the Devil with the goat. It's fine. It works. I get it. The Tower card I think is really great. It's a Tower card that does really hold true to that foundational energy, but it's depicted in a way that is in alignment with the theme of this deck. The Star card is not my favorite in this deck, I'll just be honest. It talks about illumination from within. I do, like the message, but the artwork doesn't quite make that connection for me. Here we have the Moon card, and while I absolutely love this Moon card, I think it's quite potent. The write-up in the guidebook kind of left me a little bit wanting, and that's mostly because in their particular interpretation, the author really focused in on kind of the negative aspects of the moon, that illusion, that deceit. The artwork I think is stunning, and then when we compare that to the Sun card, this I think is one of my favorite kind of pairings in the deck, or favorite cards in the deck, because we see the moon and there is all of this negative space behind the figure and everything is going on within. And then we have the Sun card where the negative space is the figure and everything is going on outside. So it's really about focusing in on the inner world or the external world, and that there is beauty and worth in both. And I think that is just fantastic. Definitely my favorite, some of my favorite major arcana cards in this deck. And then we have our Judgment card, which is fine. It's just a stained glass window. I do think it's funny that the banner at the top says "Our dead drink the sea," which is quite amusing. So real quick, let's take a look at the minor arcana, because this is kind of where, and I've put them in order of kind of where they start kind of going a little bit off kilter for me personally. So we're going to start with the Ace of Wands, because this to me is, well, my favorite suit in the deck. But one of the things that I think this suit does really well is we see a very clear progression in the suit itself. So we have the Wild Horse here, that pure potential. We have the Two of Wands, which kind of represents the taming of the horse. The Three of Wands, which represents the kind of creating the horseshoes so that we can go out and ride the horse. We have the Four of Wands, which, is kind of like we've managed to tame the horse, we've put it in a stall, and we're kind of getting to know it. We're becoming friends with the horse. Here in the Five of Wands, we see we're kind of breaking the horse. In the Six of Wands, we've now broken the horse and we've kind of maybe won some of events that we've gone to. And the Seven of Wands, we're kind of reminded with all these reins going in different directions that kind of we got to get all those reins going in the same direction or this horse isn't going to go anywhere. We see this Eight of Wands with the horse just running free on the beach. Beautiful write-up in the guidebook about this, like there's nothing in your way, just go. Then we have our Nine of Wands, where we see the horse and rider looking a little maybe tired, maybe a little worn out. Like this was a lot of work to get to this point, right? To create this kind of relationship between horse and rider. And then we have our Ten of Wands, where we have the horse, and she talks about this being the racehorse that's kind of being treated like a pack mule, and that's not really what it's for, right? That it's trying to serve a purpose that it's not really meant to serve, and so that causes some issue there. In our quartz, I really love in this suit, we have our baby with the little toy horse, you know, that real full potential there, that new beginning. We have the Knight of Wands, and she's got her riding cap there. She's ready to go out into the world. We have this beautiful Queen of Wands who feels very much in harmony with nature and the horse and her, and they all feel like they're one cohesive energy working together. And then we have this beautiful King of Wands who has the same horse that the baby had, and we see that this is the king who's learned all the lessons from the page through up to her being the king now. So this suit to me totally makes sense in the progression. We have that full potential that we kind of have to hone, we have to train, we have to befriend, we have to go through the hardships with it. You know, we have to keep it going, and it shows us here how we've kind of learned all of those lessons along the way. To me, this suit totally makes sense because I have been in all of these positions, right? I've been in this one a lot. Now moving on to the suit of coins, this is the suit of community. And I do think that this suit, while not quite as cohesive in terms of its kind of numerological progression, does show the many facets of community. So we have, you know, kind of the people who help you represented here. Here we see kind of more idea of community, saving for the hard times, knowing that sometimes this little write-up was kind of funny because like no matter what this dude did, this plant was just not gonna live, which sometimes happens. This is one of those cards that I felt like you really needed to read the guidebook to understand what was going on, because there was a whole story related back to this. You know, we have the kind of weaver here. Again, for me, that kind of ties back into that butcher baker. It's not a candlestick maker, but it's a weaver. And I feel like that does kind of follow well with this suit. Fruits of our labor and the kind of the happily ever after. Now, while the quartz don't quite mesh, I think, as well as they do in the wands, I definitely can see the correlation. Like here's the page who's learning how to fish. We have the knight who's kind of plodding along on his tractor. Queen of coins here, which that's kind of my cards, and I do really like this one because we have the mother and child working together to create the clothes. And then we have this very handsome king of coins, which the guidebook talks about him just kind of coming into his own, being his own person, and I think that's beautiful. So I definitely see the energy of community represented here through the suit of coins, and I think it works quite well. And then we get into the suit of swords, where things start going a little bit wonky for me, where I'm kind of starting to struggle a little bit with why things are the way that they are. So we have the Ace of Swords, where it talks in the guidebook about the unicorn being the national animal of Scotland, even though it's not like a real creature and that people still believe in it. Anyway, we have this unicorn and we have these snakes all intertwined for the Two of Swords. I think that works. It really talks about, you know, kind of those mangled ideas. The Three of Swords in this deck speaks to heartbreak. That's in the card and the guidebook. That's not how I read the three. That's always going to be a sticking point for me because that's just not how I read the three. Here we have the resting mermaid. We have the little squirrel with all of his gems that really, he's hoarding them, but really they serve no purpose. It's not like he can eat them or anything, right? Our Six of Swords with our salmon and our fox and our lion and our sad little wolf. And here we have kind of the Ouroboros thing. Creature in pain just keeps kind of reinventing his own pain as he's eating himself round and around. And then we have our quartz, which I do think work fairly well for the suit of swords. You know, there's kind of an arrogant energy to this little page. We have kind of a sticking to it and really mastering what it is that we want to put out into the world with our knight. Our Queen of Swords is great. She's like, I'm going to tell you like it is, whether you want to hear it or not, and that's just too dang bad. And then we have our King of Swords, which again, he very much knows his own mind, which is great. My issue with the suit of swords, or where I kind of start having some question, is we have some mythical creatures and some real creatures. So there's no real tie-in or progression that we see like we saw loosely in the suit of coins and very clearly in the suit of wands. And so I'm a little bit unsure about why there's some mythical creatures and some regular, just everyday animals. Then we get to the suit of cups, where I have total disconnect because we've gone completely away from humans all to animals in the suit of cups. There's no people in this suit at all. And this is a deck that speaks about being representative of the human experience. Now, I'm on board for animals, kind of, you know, using animals in decks and animals representing human experiences. But the thing that I think is the most interesting about this one, or that has the most question for me, is that our courts are animals. And it's the only suit where there are any animals in the courts. The rest of the deck, all the court cards are people. So perhaps that could be, you know, tying into the whole idea of kind of that the animalistic nature of our emotions. So this King of Cups kind of throws me because, like, it's an owl. It's, when I see birds, I think air, I think swords. But I mean, I do get an owl does relate to intuition, so maybe that's where they're going with it. I'd have to really dive back into the guidebook again to kind of distinguish that a little bit more, but I feel like there wasn't a ton about it. So anyway, this is where I'm kind of like, where did we go? We were in this human world, right? With the exception of we started kind of straying here in the swords, and now we've gone full into the animal kingdom. But at least I guess there is cohesion, because this entire suit is all animals. And so that is the kind of tying the thread through this suit, the progression, so to speak. Although we have animals that kind of span the gamut. We have water animals and air animals and land animals. You know, it does span the gamut of, I guess, types of animals that you might find to represent the human experience. But after experiencing these cards, these suits in this very human-esque world, and then coming to these less human-esque qualities and more animal-related in the swords and cups, that was a little bit jarring for me. Now, do keep in mind that when I'm talking about this was me going through the deck, one suit at a time, trying to get to know it, trying to get to know each of the cards, the structure for the suit itself. When we're looking at the major arcana, there's like a mix of things in here, right? We do have an animal and the devil, but it is primarily, we have the horse heads in the chariot, but it is primarily people. Okay, so you might be thinking, wow, that's like super harsh, right? But what I'm trying to kind of explain here, or hopefully explore together, is how this deck, as disjointed as some of the cards feel, and as much as I struggle with some of the suits, and like, I don't really understand why some of the things are the way they are, I want to kind of articulate how I've gone from being in this place with this deck on my initial first impression, my initial kind of personal walkthrough that I did, and reading the guidebook and going, I do not freaking get it. I don't get what's going on here. Why is this here? Why is this here? And then we have all of these human cards, right? Why is there animals in the courts? Why is there this? Why is there that? Then I did readings with this deck. Then I did some readings. And where this deck really begins to shine is when you actually start using it. Because of course, when we do readings, we're not looking at the deck in a progression, right? We're not looking at it from the Ace of Wands to the Ten of Wands. We're getting a mix of things on the table, right? They're not in the same suit. They're not in the same element. They're not in the same category. And so we start getting that meshing and mingling, which is as tarot is meant to be read. It's not meant to be read in a linear fashion, although we do often like to speak of it in that way, right? We like to talk about the Fool's Journey. We like to talk about the progression of the suits. And I do think that's important for the structure of the deck, but this deck does end up actually working quite well when we mix it all together and we get those energies kind of all mingling and flowing together in the same kind of reading. So let's go ahead and do a couple sample readings, because that's, I think, where this deck really shines. Let's give it a shuffle. Let's give it a reading, see how it does. Shuffles beautifully. It's your typical Llewellyn cardstock, which I do really like. because it riffle shuffles absolutely beautifully. Okay, so let's do a 3-card reading. So we have the Page of Wands, the 9 of Coins, and the Empress. And they do look quite beautiful on the table. The artwork is absolutely gorgeous, right? And I really do love the brown backing. It kind of looks like it's on like craft paper, like right I have here, which I do really love. So let's look back now. We're going to our Page of Wands. The full potential. So right, the full potential of the situation. We have the 9 of Coins there, with, let's just quickly look that up, with kind of that comfort and contentment. You've done the hard work and now you're enjoying, you know, all of the fruits of your labor. And we have the Empress, the kind of the baker there. This is a return to basics, right? That comfort, the encouragement, and the warm homemade bread. So when we're looking at this as a 3-card reading, like if I were to do this as just a 3-card reading to maybe start my week, what I'm maybe looking at is kind of the potential is there for me to reconnect with the simple things in life, to remember where I've done the hard work, and to remember to enjoy the fruits of those labors. I think that's a beautiful message, and I do really like the way that these all kind of work together. They all read together. Oh, there's that Queen of Swords. She's quite lovely. That Moon. And the 3 of Coins. So here you can see where we've got like a lot more space going on. And we have just these 2 figures here in the Queen of Swords and the Moon. And then we have this kind of collaboration going on here in the 3 of Coins. We have the Queen of Swords, and that was really talking about that speaking your truth, right? Knowing the truth, saying the truth, even when the truth isn't really what anybody wants to hear. The Moon in this deck really speaks to that kind of shadow energy of kind of that illusion, that deceit type of energy, which is not the way that I read the Moon. So I would read the Moon as kind of getting in touch with the depths within, getting in touch with what's going on beneath the surface within yourself. So this to me, where we see the Queen of Swords, is like looking at the Moon. She's saying basically, you need to check yourself and get real with what's going on within you. And maybe what we need to do here is look to others to kind of help us, to support us, right? And I talked about, you know, the work is easier to do when you share it. So maybe this is telling us that we need to kind of look within, honor that truth, and get the support that we need in order to do that work. So another place where this deck really shines for me is when I pair it with other decks. So I've done a couple pairings with it, but I've picked out some other decks that I thought might work beautifully with it. One of the things with this kind of lack of a background, or really focused on these central images, these central figures, it really allows the Oracle deck a lot of expansive space, and it really adds a much heavier weight to the reading than I would normally get in this type of pairing. So let's go ahead and do a couple of pairings just so you can see what I'm talking about. One of the decks that I thought of immediately is the Earth Wisdom Oracle. The Earth Wisdom feels a little bit more in the past, whereas the Scorpio Sea Tarot feels a little bit more in the modern world. But I thought it might be interesting because the Celtic mythology is supposed to kind of weave its way through this deck. So I wanted to give them a try just to see how they would do. So here we have Practical Intuition between the Chariot and the Moon. I mean, that works. That works, right? So here we have Transformation between the 3 of Wands and the Sun. The art style, of course, of these decks is very different, but I was looking more at kind of trying to pull in a little bit more of that mythology through the Earth Wisdom Oracle. So here we have Divine Protection between the 7 of Swords and the Empress. I do kind of like the contrast of the kind of brown craft paper background and the kind of a little bit more minimalistic artwork of the Scorpio Sea in comparison, or in contrast to the fuller, kind of richer, darker imagery in the Earth Wisdom. I think that's quite lovely. So here we have Divine Love between the 9 of Swords and the World. Again, I think the color palettes are quite compatible, even though we have a little bit more of this minimalistic. And I use that term very, very loosely here because the artwork itself is very, very detailed, but there's no background. So we're not getting like a full scene depicted. We're just getting a kind of character, a figure, and it's on that kind of plain background, really asking you to hone in on that figure. And whereas here in the Earth Wisdom Oracle, we're kind of looking at a bigger picture, a more scenic look, kind of drawing these figures maybe into this artwork, which is quite interesting. So again, kind of tapping into that earth energy. I thought that the shamanic medicine cards might work really well with this particular deck. Again, it's pulling in that earthy energy, has a little bit of an ancestral vibe for me, but I thought that the messages and the artwork might be really cohesive. Again, I'm really kind of feeling myself drawn to those darker, more fuller oracle decks in the center, because the artwork in the Scorpio Sea is a bit more on the sort of minimalistic or kind of devoid of a background type of imagery here. And so I feel like the oracle deck really kind of helps it like expand outward. So here we have West with Purge between the 10 of Swords and the 5 of Coins. I mean, yeah, that's some energy we should definitely be purging. Here we have the Ancestor card for Wisdom between the Knight of Wands and the Fool. That works quite well together. I feel like the art styles are fairly similar too, which is always a bonus. Here we have Staff for Foundations between the 9 of Coins and the Magician. We have our Cave for Retreat between the 3 of Cups and the 5 of Wands. Yep, let's retreat from all of this going on over here. Let's go within, regain our kind of balance and harmony. That's quite beautiful. And one last deck is the Messages from the Light Meditation deck. Again, a little bit in the similar kind of art style, I think, but these keywords might also really help to pull out kind of that deeper layer or that more expansive message from the Scorpio Sea. And you can see here we have Awakening between the Hierophant and the Ace of Coins. Contemplation between the Queen of Wands and the Ace of Swords. That's quite beautiful. We see some correlations going on in color as well here. We have the kind of sunset background going on in the Contemplation card, which kind of mimics what's going on over here between the flowers and her hair and the horse, kind of symbolizing that pillar there, that stability, that strength. And then we have the figure itself here really ties into that unicorn and the Ace of Swords for me. So it feels like this card of Contemplation is asking you to take this Ace of Swords energy and put it into this Queen of Wands that we can see kind of reflected here in this Contemplation card, which I think is quite lovely. Cherish between the King of Swords and the High Priestess. I love here how these branches kind of a little bit mimic what's going on with her hands here, right? We have maybe that King of Swords, that truth energy is being cultivated here in the center, in this nest here, and we need to cherish that truth, that understanding, that mastery, and we need to, you know, tap into it and let it kind of shape who we are going to become. I do think that's quite lovely, and I love when the artwork kind of gives me stuff to kind of take a look at and dive deeper into in terms of what's going on that is similar, and where can I find the tarot cards within the oracle card? How can I draw that message out even more? And I think that's beautiful. Meditation between Judgment and Justice. Again, we can kind of see similar things going on in the artwork here, where we have this almost stained glass look effect in the figure here in the center, and we have kind of the white of her shirt, the white of the dove represented here in the lotus, and we also have the scales kind of tying back into the balance in the hands here. So here this meditation card is kind of inviting me to take justice and judgment and bring them together into balance, like we see here in this meditation card, which I think is quite lovely. So now that we've had a chance to kind of look at the deck, talk about some of the things that I've struggled with this deck, we've looked at it in terms of some pairings, we've done some sample readings. Now let's kind of talk about like a little bit of a wrap up. So where this deck kind of falls flat for me, let's just start with that. As I mentioned, there seems to be a general lack of cohesion in the deck, whereas some of the cards do feel a little bit out of place, like those mythological cards, those mythological creatures, of which there are very, very few. That kind of fell a little flat for me, and the fact that I didn't really understand why they were included in a deck that was very much more in the mundane realm. And there are places in the guidebook where the messages in the guidebook and the artwork don't really mesh for me. Now that's pretty common when you have a guidebook written by somebody who's not the artist of the deck. Let's just be honest about that. It does happen quite frequently because you've got two different people basically layering their own interpretations onto the cards. And sometimes there can be a bit of a disconnect between that, just as I'm looking at it, sharing my thoughts on it, and there would be a disconnect, I'm sure, for them in terms of what I see in the card versus what the artist saw when they drew it and the guidebook author saw when they wrote the guidebook. So there are just a few places where that happens for me, where I'm like, I don't see what you're seeing in the card. I don't see what you're talking about, and it's not really clicking for me. But overall, those are kind of my really just nitpicky things that I feel like this deck kind of misses the mark for me or falls a little bit flat. Now, the things that this deck does really well, and there are several, is one is diversity. So let me find some people cards, which I may have already gone past. Even look at this mermaid. This mermaid is a little bit more full figured. We have different skin tones, and we have different ages, which I really appreciate because the majority of the decks we have all feature super young, pretty people, right? Even when it's diverse, they're always still young. And that to me negates a whole section of our population, not to mention that it kind of devalues the wisdom that comes from age. So I love that the kings and queens in this deck are older people. That is one of the, I think, the best things about this deck is that we get that in a lot of the cards. I mean, look at this Queen of Swords. She is beautiful. She has wisdom and she's going to share it. Same with our king here. So if we kind of take a look at this deck kind of spread out here, this deck overall feels very human. Feel like we're in the human world having human experiences, with the exception, I guess, of the quartz in the cups, and even to some respect, the cup suit itself does feel a little bit more, it's in the animal realm, which is a bit of a disconnect for me based on the overall context of this deck, right? This deck feels very warm, homey, inviting. It feels like a deck of people that you could get to know on an individual level, right? When we're looking at this Four of Coins, we could get to know this person. We could get to know this lady and the Two of Coins here. We could get to know these three people in the Three of Coins, this person in the King of Swords, this Queen of Swords, right? We could even get to know the people in this Eight of Coins that are fixing the roof. So it feels overall like a very human deck, like very much a deck of having a human experience. Except for, again, I don't get the shift to the animals in the cups, but we do have animals in other places in the deck too, so I don't want to harp on that too much. But overall, it does make the deck feel very accessible. So another thing that this deck does very well, I think, is the court cards. With the exception of the cups, the court cards do feel very accessible. I feel like, again, these are people that I can get to know, and I can kind of explore the courts, which can be a struggle for a lot of us, through these very human characters. And so I think that sometimes can help make the courts feel a bit more approachable. The Suit of Wands, as I mentioned, is my favorite in this deck. It feels very cohesive. And one of the other things that I do actually really like about this deck is the fact that there is no background. Now, at first I thought that was gonna be like, oh my goodness, I'm not gonna know what to do with these, right? There's no context here. But the thing is that this deck relies kind of, I think, on your reading for the context. You can also pull that in, as we saw, through a second deck, an oracle deck, or, you know, kind of maybe putting out multiple cards, doing larger readings. But as they kind of feel like you can take these energies and you can put them into situations, right? You can visualize or actualize, if you're using actual cards to do it with, this particular chariot being in any situation that you're currently facing. And I do think that actually works quite well. And I think that's one of the strengths of this deck that I don't know that I've really seen mentioned anywhere. Granted, I haven't watched a lot of videos on this deck or anything because I didn't want to really be influenced by anybody else's thoughts or opinions before I had a chance to kind of come to my own with it. I will definitely be watching some videos with it now, just so I can see how other people have experienced it, and maybe that will help me kind of come to terms with some of the issues that I'm still facing with this deck. So the other thing that I feel like this deck does really well, as I mentioned, is that it works beautifully for larger readings, and it works extraordinarily well with oracle decks. This, I think, is a deck that absolutely blossoms when you pair it with an oracle deck. There is just something about this kind of highly focused in on a single energy, a single element, a single theme, a single person that allows you to really expand on the reading with an oracle deck, to really add a whole nother layer, and you can explore these individual characters through that added layer of your oracle or tarot or whatever it is that you're pairing it with. This deck works beautifully for that, probably better than I think most of the decks in my collection. This deck feels like pairing it with an oracle deck actually creates a more fuller story. So it's not like it's adding detail, it's actually creating the background for which these cards can fully blossom, which I think is really, really cool. So there are a couple questions that this deck has kind of left me with, and I'm going to kind of pose them to you. If you have this deck, or maybe you saw something here in this video that might kind of help answer these questions for me, I would love to know what your thoughts are. So the main questions that this deck has kind of left me with is, what significance does the fact that it's based on a fantasy young adult story actually have on the deck? So there's no mention of any relationship between the cards and in the guidebook. So I'm assuming that it's based on a book. So these might be characters, right, from a book. But I don't know who they are. I would like to know who they are so that if I decided that's an element I want to add to this deck, I could. Otherwise, I'm left wondering why it's even based on a book, what the point is, what does that add to this deck, what layer does that add over the top of it. They talk about this deck being a layer over the bones of tarot, but you're not specifying what that layer is, right? How does that layer relate to the fact that this is based on a novel? And I'm kind of left wondering what significance that actually has on the deck itself. Are there things in here that I'm totally missing out on because I haven't read the book? It does not keep me from working with the deck, and it does not really inhibit my ability to use this deck effectively, but I feel like I might be missing something by not understanding, like, is this a character from the story? Would I be able to understand this Page of Swords more if I knew who he was? And I kind of feel like that's something that I find myself questioning all the time, knowing that this deck was based on a book. These are not questions that I would have if that weren't the case. If this was just a collection of illustrations by the artist and it didn't have any reference to anything else in the world, I would just be like, other than tarot, I'd just be like, oh, okay, I get it. That's cool. It's a cat and it's, learned its lesson. Here it is. But is there some significance to cats in the book? And I feel like that's the piece of the puzzle I'm missing. So my final takeaway, I think this deck is actually a wonderful reader. I really enjoy pairing it with Oracle. It just, I can't even tell you, it just blossoms so much. I really don't find that disjointedness that I spoke a lot about in the minor arcana, and that there's mythical creatures and then there's mythology, but it's very, very small. And most of the stuff is sort of in this human realm, but then we have some animals. Like, despite all of that, when you mix this deck up, when you shuffle it and you do readings with it, it actually works beautifully. It's a beautiful reader. And like Melissa Sinova says in the guidebook, there is much more going on here beneath the surface than we see at first glance. But I do think that this is a deck that you kind of need to get to know. You need to read the guidebook. You need to understand where the author and artist is coming from in relation to these cards, I think, in order to be able to make that connection. And of course, yes, we want to add our own foundations in that, right? We want to layer it with our own intuition, but I think this is a deck that doesn't make a lot of sense if you don't understand where everybody's coming from with it. And it really is a beautiful reader. So my takeaway is, am I glad I have it? Yes. Is it a deck that kind of leaves me with more questions than it answers sometimes? Yes. Mostly because I feel like there's a piece of the puzzle with this deck that I'm missing, and I don't know exactly what it is. However, it does not keep me from using it, and I am really enjoying working with it. So I want to thank Llewellyn for sending me this deck to share with you today, and I would love to know what your thoughts are on it, so please feel free to share with me in the comments below. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.